Before the heavy machinery tore through South Los Angeles, the borders were soft, painted in the invisible language of local sidewalks and familiar avenues. In the late 1960s, young men walked down Imperial Highway, or 117th Street, navigating unspoken agreements forged over generations. Neighborhoods were connected by contiguous residential grids where every porch had eyes and every alley was known. But that organic geography was about to be obliterated by thousands of tons of concrete and rebar. The decision did not originate on the streets, but in cold, air-conditioned offices far from the communities that would bear the cost. Urban planning executives and state officials drew a straight line across the map of South Los Angeles, designating the corridor for the Century Freeway, known formally as Interstate 105. On paper, it was presented as a high-speed artery connecting El Segundo to Norwalk. In practice, treating infrastructure as a knife, it was a social engineering project that would permanently carve up the urban landscape. First proposed in 1956, the project sat stagnant for decades due to furious legal challenges and community opposition. As civil rights lawsuits dragged through federal courts, the state began acquiring property through eminent domain across South Los Angeles. Long before the first tractor arrived, the shadow of displacement hung over working-class families. Entire housing tracts were condemned, boarded up, and left to rot, creating artificial blights long before the actual trench was dug. When full construction finally took hold, the scale of destruction was staggering. More than 25,000 residents were uprooted, forced to abandon homes, churches, and small businesses that had anchored the black and brown working class for decades. Whole blocks disappeared from the city directory. What remained was a raw, dusty canyon cutting east to west, a physical void that severed long-standing residential networks and scattered tight-knit families across the basin. This massive physical scar altered the natural flow of daily life. Streets that had once connected neighborhoods were abruptly dead-ended into high chain-link fences and dirt mounds. A walk to the local market or elementary school that once took 3 minutes now required a winding trek around massive construction pits. By severing the grid, urban planning stripped away the casual, daily contact between neighboring blocks, creating isolated enclaves surrounded by industrial wasteland. For those who stayed, the physical environment turned hostile. Towering gray sound walls, 20 feet tall, rose alongside the excavated trench, blocking sunlight and casting deep shadows over residential lawns. Houses that once looked across tree-lined avenues now faced sheer walls of cold concrete. The neighborhood was effectively boxed in, cut off from municipal investment, and left to adjust to a claustrophobic new reality defined by heavy dust and constant diesel noise. As the physical landscape fractured, the street politics of South Los Angeles shifted rapidly to match the new terrain. Local sets that had previously shared flexible or fluid territorial limits found themselves separated by an uncrossable divide. The giant ditch acted as a permanent boundary line, forcing street organizations to remap their strongholds. What had been a single unified neighborhood was now divided into north and south factions, each adapting to its newly imposed borders. Treating infrastructure as a passive utility ignores the cold mechanics of power embedded in urban development. The placement of the 105 freeway was not an accident of geography, but a political choice that routed noise, pollution, and isolation directly through disenfranchised neighborhoods. While affluent suburbs successfully fought off freeway expansion, South Los Angeles was forced to absorb the physical burden, proving once again that in the land of no pity, political vulnerability dictates where the concrete falls. Throughout the 1980s, construction dragged on, turning the center of South Los Angeles into an open industrial zone. Heavy cranes, earth movers, and massive concrete pillars dominated the skyline alongside growing street violence. As the city experienced unprecedented social friction, the physical chaos of the freeway construction provided cover in chaos. The open trenches and half-built overpasses became uncharted territory, unpoliced terrain where young men established new rules of survival. Commercial corridors that had sustained local economies along Century Boulevard were completely gutted. Small grocers, auto repair shops, and family restaurants were bulldozed to clear the right-of-way. The removal of legitimate economic hubs created a vacuum that was quickly filled by underground markets. Deprived of normal commercial flow, the isolated pockets under and around the rising freeway bridges became ideal zones for illicit trade, taxation, and shadow governance. The architectural design of the freeway created distinct tactical features on the ground. Dead-end cul-de-sacs created where the state cut off residential streets, turned quiet residential blocks into natural bottlenecks. For territorial sets, these dead ends offered single entry points that were easily monitored and defended against outsiders. The concrete pillars supporting the elevated lanes created blind spots and covered staging areas, reshaping how turf was held and contested. Underpasses and pedestrian bridges quickly became dangerous choke points. To cross from one side of the 105 corridor to the other, residents had to pass through dark, echoed concrete tunnels that offered no clear line of sight. These narrow passages became high-stakes checkpoints where territorial taxation was enforced. The physical structure of the freeway did not eliminate friction between rival groups. It concentrated it into violent, highly predictable geographic funnels. The human toll extended deep into the domestic sphere of the surrounding neighborhoods. Children growing up in the shadow of the freeway spent their youth playing in the shadow of massive support columns, cut off from parks and recreational centers that lay just a few hundred yards away across the concrete barrier. Spatial isolation bred a deep sense of confinement, reinforcing the psychological reality that their world was bounded by state-erected walls. Over time, sets located on opposite sides of the freeway trench evolved into entirely distinct entities. Groups that had once shared common roots and alliances drifted apart, separated by the physical impossibility of daily interaction. Distance measured in yards turned into a deep ideological chasm. Former allies became bitter rivals, fighting over control of the narrow underpasses that served as the only connections between their newly defined territories. In October 1993, after nearly 3 decades of planning, litigation, and construction, the Century Freeway officially opened to traffic. Costing over $2 billion, making it one of the most expensive freeways per mile in American history, it was celebrated by city officials as a triumph of modern engineering. Suburbs were now connected to the airport, and commuters could bypass local streets entirely. But beneath the polished asphalt lay a permanently altered urban ecosystem. The contrast was stark and unyielding. High above the street level, suburban commuters glided past South Los Angeles at 60 miles per hour, completely detached from the communities below. Down on the ground, the street grid remained broken and fragmented. The freeway provided rapid transit for those passing through, but offered only noise, pollution, and structural isolation for the people who lived in its shadow. With the freeway fully operational, the new territorial borders were cemented permanently into place. The physical concrete barrier was now reinforced by 6 lanes of high-speed traffic and massive concrete retaining walls. Territorial claims were no longer negotiated through fluid street presence. They were anchored to the permanent concrete geography of the highway. The 105 freeway had drawn the final, immutable lines on the map of South Los Angeles. The economic long-term consequences were immediate and severe. Property values along the freeway corridor plummeted, discouraging private investment and ensuring that residential blocks near the elevated lanes remained trapped in economic stagnation. With legitimate job opportunities declining further and commercial investment fleeing the area, street sets became the primary economic engine and social structure for young people trapped within these newly isolated sectors. Underneath the massive overpasses, A complex system of shadow authority took root. The sheltered space beneath the elevated lanes became neutral ground for clandestine meetings, or designated territory, where specific groups levied taxes on illicit activity. In the absence of traditional community investment or effective municipal presence, power dynamics adapted to the physical shelter provided by the state's massive steel and concrete canopy. Analyzing the 105 Freeway reveals a repeating pattern in the history of Los Angeles urban planning. Time and again, major infrastructure decisions have been used to manage, divide, and isolate lower-income communities under the guise of progress. By treating infrastructure as a purely technical project, planners shielded themselves from the predictable social costs, leaving vulnerable neighborhoods to absorb the catastrophic fallout of systemic engineering. This legacy was not unique to the Century Freeway. It followed the template established decades earlier by the construction of the Harbor Freeway and the Golden State Freeway. Each highway project cut through vibrant working-class neighborhoods, displacing populations and entrenching racial and economic segregation. The 105 was simply the final, most expensive chapter in a long historical cycle that prioritized regional transit over local survival. For generations of South Los Angeles residents, the physical trauma of the freeway remains an open wound. Older community members still remember tree-lined avenues and connected neighborhoods that were erased to make way for concrete pillars. Their children and grandchildren grew up knowing only the fractured grid, accepting the sound walls and dark underpasses as natural features of the urban landscape, unaware of the vibrant community that once stood in their place. Today, the structural geography created by the 105 Freeway continues to dictate the terms of street-level existence. The dead ends, sound walls, and underpass choke points remain exactly where engineers placed them decades ago, continuing to enforce territorial divisions between neighborhood sets. Though the names on the street may change over time, the concrete architecture remains absolute, outlasting generations of residents and street leaders alike. The 105 Freeway stands as a stark monument to how urban planning shapes social outcomes. It proved that a city can be permanently segmented without ever firing a shot, simply by laying down enough concrete to break the human ties that bind a neighborhood together. South Los Angeles was re-engineered from above, transforming an interconnected urban flatland into a maze of isolated pockets defined by highway infrastructure. Treating urban planning as a silent form of political power reveals the cold reality of how cities are built and managed. The borders of South Los Angeles were not drawn by chance or settled by mutual street agreements. They were carved out by civil engineers, approved by politicians, and poured in reinforced concrete. The geography of survival on these streets was designed in offices decades before the first trench was dug. In the end, the history of the Century Freeway is written in the permanent shadows cast by its elevated lanes. High above, the taillights of commuting traffic streak toward the ocean, while below, the street grid remains forever broken. In the land of no pity, the concrete never forgives and never moves, leaving an entire city to live within the rigid borders carved out by a freeway that was never built for them. Get Land of No Pity at lahoodpolitics.com.